If you support remote SharePoint users who do a lot of work offline, you probably hear about it when they can't update an internal SharePoint site with time-critical data because they're on a plane or in the field, out of reach of your company's intranet. This video shows how you can set up a SharePoint 2010 server with SharePoint Workspace clients to help solve that problem. SharePoint Workspace allows SharePoint users to easily take site content offline to their local computers and then automatically synchronize with the SharePoint server when they go back online. In this video, we'll cover how to configure a SharePoint server to support content synchronization with SharePoint Workspace clients, how to configure SharePoint site permissions for SharePoint Workspace clients, how to deploy usage policies in the SharePoint Workspace application to clients, and finally, how to test your setup prior to deploying for production. Keep in mind as we proceed that SharePoint Workspace is a client application included with Office 2010 Professional Plus. The SharePoint Workspace application lets Office users create SharePoint workspaces as well as other types of workspaces. So you'll notice references to both the SharePoint Workspace application and the SharePoint workspaces that can be created with it. SharePoint workspaces depend on access to SharePoint 2010 servers. So for a successful client deployment, first make sure that the servers hosting your SharePoint team sites can support that access. On each server, you'll need to confirm or set the following conditions and consider the recommendations. For added security, you'll want to configure secure socket layer protection on the port that'll be used for SharePoint Workspace connections. This SSL configuration is strongly recommended because no default encryption security is in place. Make sure that Remote Differential Compression, or RDC, is installed on the SharePoint server. RDC supports offline synchronization protocols and optimizes performance during document transfer between SharePoint Workspace and SharePoint Server. To check RDC status, open the Windows Server Manager on the SharePoint server system and then click Add Features. In the Add Features wizard, make sure that the Remote Differential Compression checkbox is selected. If it isn't, click Next and then follow the wizard instructions to install RDC. Next, make sure that offline client availability is enabled for SharePoint sites. This is the default condition, but administrators can change it. To check this setting for a site, click Site Actions, then Site Settings. Under Site Administration, click Search and Offline Availability. And finally, in the Offline Client Availability section, make sure that Yes is selected for the setting Allow items from this site to be downloaded to offline clients. This lets SharePoint users take content offline for offsite work. Now make sure to list the URLs of client-accessible sites in the alternate access mapping list on the SharePoint server. You'll find alternate access mappings under System Settings of the Central Administration interface on SharePoint 2010 servers. And one more thing. If your organization uses line of business interoperability or lobby lists to connect to an external database instead of to the server database, and if SharePoint users have to take these lists offline, ensure that offline synchronization of external lists is enabled on the SharePoint server. You can configure this setting from the SharePoint Central Admin interface by going to System Settings and clicking Manage Farm Features. This setting can also be configured at the site level by clicking Site Actions, Site Settings, and under Site Actions, Manage Site Features. Once you've prepared the SharePoint server for workspace connections, make sure that site administrators have granted the necessary permissions for SharePoint Workspace users who will be accessing the site. SharePoint site permissions are inherited by SharePoint Workspace users. Permissions defined for the site determine what users can do with site content once it's downloaded to their local workspaces. Users must have at least read permission in order to synchronize SharePoint content with the SharePoint workspace, but typically site administrators will want to grant contribute permission as well. For more information about how to configure access to SharePoint sites, see the list of resources at the end of this course. Now you're ready to deploy the software and any usage or security policies that apply to your organization. As with other Office applications, you can customize the software deployment by including group policies. For example, you may want to deploy a policy that blocks the use of Groove workspaces and shared folders on clients that will be synchronizing with SharePoint sites. These workspace types, Groove workspaces and shared folders, enable peer collaboration and content sharing, which you may want to discourage if you set up central content storage on SharePoint servers. You'll find policies for SharePoint Workspace in the spw14.admx file, located with the Office 2010 administrative template files on your Active Directory server. Policies that affect SharePoint workspaces include the one just mentioned, the Prohibit Groove Workspaces policy, which lets you block use of Groove workspaces and shared folders so that only SharePoint workspaces are supported. But you may also want to deploy a SharePoint policy that blocks SharePoint workspace connections from outside corporate firewalls, unless those connections are made over an SSL-protected port. That's the Sync Only on Domain Network policy. You can learn more about this and other policies that affect SharePoint workspaces by checking the list of resources at the end of this course. Once you've identified the necessary policies, here's how we suggest that you proceed with the deployment. Make sure that test clients can access the test SharePoint server over port 80 or another browser port. Preferably, this should be an SSL-protected port such as 443, as noted before, especially when you're preparing for a production rollout. For more information about SharePoint Workspace port settings, see the resources listed at the end of this video. Next, set up a test environment and deploy SharePoint Workspace to test clients according to your organization's best practices. Do not deploy for production until you've tested and verified the setup. To test your setup, you'll need at least one SharePoint Workspace client with browser access and read-write permissions for a SharePoint site. You may want to create some test documents for downloading as well. The goal is to create a SharePoint workspace on a client, so you can verify data synchronization in both directions. Let's test a model setup so you can see what to expect. First, we'll make sure that SharePoint Workspace is running and present in the system tray on a local client. Then we'll browse to a SharePoint site, and from the Site Actions menu, we'll select Sync to SharePoint Workspace. This creates a SharePoint workspace on the local computer. We'll click OK to download all the content from the site. But there are other ways to download selected content, which you can learn about from the SharePoint Workspace resources listed at the end of this video. After a while, depending on download size and network conditions, we'll be able to open the local workspace and see the downloaded content. Then we'll test the process of updating the document list locally while the client is offline. We'll start by disconnecting the client from the corporate network or from the Internet. From the new SharePoint workspace, we'll edit one of the downloaded documents. And save it. Then we'll add another folder to the list. Then, after reconnecting to the intranet, we'll browse to the SharePoint site, conveniently accessible from the workspace, to make sure that synchronization is up to date. Notice that the new folder appears, and the new edits appear in the updated document. If the content didn't seem to be synchronizing and changes didn't appear as expected after a short time, we'd try accessing the site from a browser to see if we had network connectivity. You may want to experiment further by editing a SharePoint document from the browser and confirming the update in your local SharePoint workspace. Or you may want to test clients at various locations, but this sample can help you establish a baseline level of success. When you're satisfied with results, you'll be ready to deploy SharePoint Workspace for production. At the end, your Office users will have a tool for easily synchronizing local content with SharePoint site libraries and lists. For more information about how SharePoint Workspace can be deployed and used, see the web pages listed here.